When we think of war, we think of the clash of swords, the roar of cannons, the smoke of battlefields. But what happens after the armies are gone? What happens when the men who defended their homes are buried and the victors stand at the gates of the city? For the Ottoman Empire, the great power that ruled for centuries across Europe, Asia, and Africa, the answer is chilling. The fate that awaited women, wives, and daughters of the conquered was not just about slavery. It was about a deliberate system designed to erase entire cultures from the inside out. Death on the battlefield could be quick, even honorable. But survival? Survival could mean something far worse. It meant being pulled into a world where your name, your faith, your identity, even your children, no longer belong to you. For many, it was a living death. The Ottomans didn't just conquer land, they conquered people's futures. In the smoke-filled aftermath of a battle, when soldiers scoured the ruined streets, captives were gathered like spoils of war. According to the laws of the time, 1/5 of all plunder belonged directly to the Sultan. This rule wasn't symbolic, it was enforced with terrifying efficiency. Officials would walk among the captives, pointing to the strongest boys, the healthiest young women, the most beautiful faces. These were not random choices. These were selections. The chosen were sent directly into the machinery of empire. For boys, it could mean being trained as Janissaries' Christian children taken from their families, converted and transformed into elite Ottoman soldiers who would one day fight against their own people. For girls, the path was different, but no less devastating. Many were absorbed into the Sultan's household itself, the most famous prison of all, the imperial harem. To European visitors centuries later, the harem was imagined as a place of pleasure and luxury. But for the women who were forced into it, the reality was far more complex. The imperial harem inside Topkapi Palace was a political fortress as much as a private one. It was guarded, controlled, and ruthlessly organized. Once a woman entered its gates, she never left. Her old life was erased instantly. Her name was stripped away. Her religion, her language, her identity gone. She was given a new name, forced to convert to Islam, and expected to live entirely within this new world. For some, it meant rising to positions of power. If a concubine bore the Sultan a son, she could become a woman of enormous influence. But for the woman herself, this so-called elevation was not triumph. It was humiliation. For her people outside the palace walls, her existence was a reminder of defeat. Their princess, their noblewoman, their daughter, now a mother to Ottoman princes. Nowhere was this symbolism more powerful than in 1453, when Mehmed II captured Constantinople. The fall of the Byzantine Empire was not only military, it was personal. The noble women of Byzantium were taken into Mehmed's harem, their presence serving as living proof that the 1,000-year legacy of Rome was over, and that its bloodlines now flowed into Ottoman veins. But the harem was only one part of the story. The vast majority of captured women did not find themselves behind palace walls. They were marched instead into the slave markets of Constantinople and other Ottoman cities. Here, the humiliation was public and unbearable. Women were placed on raised platforms, often stripped or half naked, while buyers examined their bodies. They were prodded, inspected, judged for beauty and health, sold as though they were animals. For noble women who had once lived in palaces, or the wives of warriors who had once stood proudly beside their men, this was the deepest cut of all, an irreversible fall from dignity to object. From the marketplace, their fates diverged. Some became domestic slaves in wealthy households, tasked with endless labor. Others were taken as concubines by soldiers or officials. For them, life was at the mercy of their master's desires. There was no recourse, no law to protect them, no possibility of returning to the life they had lost. And then there was the distribution of women as rewards. After a great conquest, the Sultan would sometimes hand out captives to his most loyal commanders, viziers, or soldiers. It was a brutal reinforcement of loyalty, but also a clear message. Human beings were the currency of empire. Victories were celebrated not only with gold and land, but with the bodies of the conquered. For the women themselves, this meant being treated not as people, but as living trophies of another man's triumph. Why was all this remembered as worse than death? To understand, we must step into the minds of the conquered societies. For Christian families in the Balkans, in Greece, in Hungary, in Armenia, faith was everything. To be forced to renounce Christianity, to be baptized into a new religion against one's will, was not seen as mere conversion. It was seen as the damnation of the soul. Parents who lost daughters into the Ottoman system often described them as if they had died, and yet the grief was heavier because their children were alive, but forever unreachable, transformed into servants of the very power that had destroyed their homeland. Then there was the question of lineage. A woman's role was not just her own. She carried the future of her family, her people, her nation. When that woman bore children for the Ottomans, those children were no longer seen as her people's future. They were raised as Muslims, as Ottomans, as part of the empire that had conquered their blood. This was not just defeat in the present. It was defeat stretched out into generations. The enemy's child could one day be the general who returned to conquer more of your land. And finally, there was the symbolism. A princess in the Sultan's harem, a noblewoman on the slave block. These were not private tragedies. They were public emblems of conquest. Their very lives became constant reminders of loss, humiliation, and powerlessness. For many men who died in battle, death came with honor. For the women who survived, survival meant years, even decades, of living as proof of defeat. This system was not an accident. It was part of how the Ottoman Empire functioned. The harem was central to dynastic politics. The slave markets were tied into the economy. The distribution of captives reinforced loyalty in the military. The devshirme system of child-taking created the janissaries, who became the empire's fiercest warriors. All of it worked together, a machine that turned conquest into continuity. And behind that machine were thousands upon thousands of broken lives. Other empires had their cruelties. The Romans sold captives into slavery. The Persians mutilated their enemies and absorbed royal families into their courts. The Mongols massacred entire populations in days of bloodshed. But the Ottomans created something chillingly structured, an institutionalized system that turned women and children into tools of state power, generation after generation. It was not chaos, it was order. And that order meant that for centuries, in villages across the Balkans and beyond, parents told their children stories of the day the Ottomans came. Stories not only of battles lost, but of sisters taken, of mothers never returned, of daughters who lived, but lived as strangers. When we stand in Istanbul today, looking at the beauty of Topkapi Palace, it's easy to be caught up in the grandeur of empire. The domes, the mosaics, the gardens, they whisper of wealth, sophistication, and power. But listen more closely, and another story emerges. The walls of that palace once held hundreds of women who had lost everything, their homes, their families, their faith. They lived out their days in silks and jewels, yes, but those silks were a prison uniform, and the jewels were chains. For them, survival was not a gift, it was a slow erasure. This is why, in the memories of those conquered by the Ottomans, capture was spoken of as worse than death. Because death was final, but capture was a lifetime of humiliation, of forced identity, of being used as a symbol of another's power. The battlefield killed the body, but the Ottoman system killed the soul. And that is a story history cannot afford to forget.